Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You may spot that I'm not Her Royal Highness Princess Thematic bint Al Hassan. Unfortunately, the princess is not well. She's lost her voice, so we're hoping that she'll be well again tomorrow for some commitments, but she won't make it today, I'm afraid. So I'd like to introduce the panel and also read a few words from the princess to get us started. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this thematic session on Science for Peace, Success and Future Responsibilities, which is organised by the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan in partnership with our colleagues and friends at the Inter-Cabinet Partnership. And I'm representing the President of the Royal Scientific Society, Princess Sumaya. I'm her advisor, and also I was Director of World Science Forum 2017, which of course was held in Jordan. The idea for this session emerged from that World Science Forum, which the RSS was honoured to host under the theme of Science for Peace. It was a confronting concept for many who heard it initially, the idea of discussing peace in a region that many who heard it, would perhaps not associate with it. But I believe that in extremely peaceful Jordan, we conveyed a message that I hope still resonates. Peace is so much more than the absence of conflict. Science for Peace signifies a call for the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and for the promise of hope and opportunity in the lives of all people in a world where borders must matter little as we struggle to build a better future. And today, as we meet in a city that was once itself on a fault line of division, it is worth remembering the tremendous power of humankind to make peace as well as war. And more importantly, to build an enduring peace that allows opportunity to flow. One very strong message that emerged from the World Science Forum in Jordan was how science, that is scientists, science diplomats, science communicators and policymakers in the area of science have in the past and may in the future help to build greater equality, security and opportunity in our world, and indeed must play an increasingly prominent role as enablers of fair and sustainable development. In 2017, we rightly celebrated some of the momentous achievements of global science policy actors in setting an agenda for peace building in all its aspects, not least through Agenda 2030. But there are new and unforeseen challenges arising that we cannot ignore. And much of the discussion of this year's forum will add to that narrative, particularly in relation to ethical responsibilities of science in society and science for society, at a time when society is rejecting much that we had taken for granted. We can and should celebrate all that we have achieved in science policy and science diplomacy, but to look forward, we must acknowledge and adapt our mission to a rapidly changing global political order and rapidly changing societies and the technologies that are shaping them. In this dynamic and often unpredictable world, how are science-led institutions and multinational agreements adapting and enduring? And how will science position itself for a future cycle of policy input and agreement? How can we ensure that the voice of science is heard and that agreed findings are properly communicated and acted upon? And how can we ensure that scientific input helps to inform and shape policy making and policy implementation across the spectrum of governance? And of course, in keeping with the vital theme of this year's forum, we might ask, what are the responsibilities and the ethical limits for science to seek a voice in political and sometimes ideological discourse? This is the small task that we set our speakers today, to give us all of these answers. Our methodology is to try to learn by example and to aim to create new pathways to enduring peace through experience, vision and focus. Evidence-based, curiosity-driven and mission-led. Our first speakers will use ongoing disarmament treaties and organisations to highlight how successful science has been in developing and maintaining a culture of science for peace by supporting powerful global norms against the use and re-emergence of certain classes of weapons. Following speakers will expand on this to encompass a broader view of peace, beyond weapons control, and assess the role of science in building that future that we imagined at the Dead Sea back in 2017. One that promises greater equality, security and opportunity, and in which science enables the peace we need for fair and sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to introduce our speakers today. Representing Dr. Lizina Zerbo, Executive Secretary of the CTBTO Preparatory Commission, we have Ms. Maral Ozal Nurkan, Director of the International Monitoring System of the CTBTO, who will deliver an address on behalf of Dr. Zerbo and further introduce herself, and set the scene for science diplomacy in action at a vital peace-building organisation. Then we have Jonathan Foreman, Science Policy Advisor and Secretary to the Scientific Advisory Board at the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, followed by Indira Nath, Professor at the Indian Academy of Sciences, Flavia Schlegel, Special Envoy for Science and Global Policy at the International Science Council, and Tallulah Oni, Global Young Academy, former co-chair and public health physician scientist. I would ask all our speakers to limit their remarks to 12 minutes. We'll be strict timekeepers on this. Then we'll have some time, we hope, for open discussion. First between the panelists, and then we can open it up to the audience if time permits. So I now call upon our opening speaker, Ms. Maral Ozal Nurkan, representing Dr. Lizina Zerbo, Executive Secretary of the CTBTO Preparatory Commission.
Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to introduce also myself. I'm here on behalf of my boss, Executive Secretary of Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, Dr. Lizina Zerbo, and I'm going to pass his opening remarks to you today. But before that, my name is Nurcan Maral Ozal. I am geophysicist coming from academia. I'm professor in seismology. And I have been performing this directorship from 2014, almost 5 years, and establishing, maintaining, and performing the job of international monitoring system, which we have been monitoring the very big global network to catch the trace of the nuclear test if there is around. And I'm going to start and passing his opening remarks, Lizina Zerbo. I would like to thank Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya bin Al Hassan, a tireless science diplomacy champion, and Professor Laszlo Lavas, President of the 2019 World Science Forum, for this invitation. It's an honor to be in Budapest today and to deliver this speech on behalf of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, Executive Secretary of Dr. Lizina Zerbo, and to celebrate of the 20th anniversary of the World Science Forum. Dr. Zerbo very much wished to join Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya and other distinguished participants in Budapest, but regrettably, due to certain overlapping in his duty travels, it was not possible today. We might disagree on many things about the state of world affairs, but we will definitely agree that we are at a defining moment in evolution of the world. This world is filled with uncertainties, marked by a loss of ground for multilateralism to the detriment of unilateralism. The world is experiencing serious crises, some of which of existential nature. There are even analysts who believe that we are at a tipping point where relations among global powers are rife with tension and mistrust. The fact that science diplomacy is experiencing a second birth, a kind of renaissance, in these times of multiple crises, is an indication that it had been successful in the past, particularly in improving international relations and preventing conflict through scientific cooperation. Indeed, seminal science diplomacy work was done during times of crisis, during the Cold War, such as the Flash. There have been and still are many science diplomacy success stories in the security field since the end of Cold War, many of which are relatively unknown or recognized as such. Cessation and or dismantling of weapons in Argentina, Iran, Kazakhstan, Libya, Russia, South Africa, and Ukraine had a major science diplomacy dimension. And of course, we have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty now, which represented a perfect blend of science and diplomacy for global security. One can also mention the track record of successful cooperation in global commons, high seas, deep seas, Antarctica with the Antarctic Treaty System, Arctic with the Arctic Council, and etc., based on science. Similarly, we witnessed global coalitions designed to address pandemics like Ebola from West and Central Africa and Zika in Latin America. At regional levels, two flagship science diplomacy initiatives remain the European Council for Nuclear Research, CERN, and the Synchrotron Light for Experimental Science and Application in the Middle East, SESAMI. From the above, it's clear that science diplomacy will remain a key instrument for the management of current and future global issues, such as sharing scarce resources such as water. There are, in my view, in Lastina's view, two main global issues that need to be urgently dealt with because they are shaking the very foundations of our civilizations. The one, the cluster of the ecological demographic urgencies, and the other one is artificial intelligence. Now, more specifically, in the peace and security area, it's clear that despite growing militarization trends and martial rhetoric, none of the global security issues have a military solution. In fact, the increase in military expenditures only makes some of them worse. Think of how those monies would have been useful in combating environmental problems. Science diplomacy can contribute in finding groundbreaking approach to global issues through enhancing the security development nexus. Through innovation, science diplomacy will be essential if we are to successfully transition from our resources-based, conflict-generating economic models to knowledge-based, inclusive and sustainable ones. In the field of nuclear security, science diplomacy could be leveraged to reignite engagement on burning issues, such as ensuring non-proliferation while promoting civilian nuclear uses, combating nuclear counterterrorism, strengthening nuclear treaties, verification compliance, promoting attention to more instruments such as Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and cooperation in ballistic missile systems. Of particular importance is the nuclear fuel cycle because it's relatively easier to keep an eye on weapons than it is for materials. For science diplomacy to fully play its role, it will have to overcome a certain number of challenges. There is a need to strike a balance between the three pillars of science diplomacy, particularly the diplomacy for science one. This will be particularly difficult because the diplomacy for science leg is often the poor parent of the science diplomacy trinity due to lack of funding, but also because science diplomacy is most of the time pursued from the angles of national interest. Therefore, we need to factor in the role non-state actors in shaping the regional and global agendas through paradiplomacy. In addition to the core benefits of science, this track 2 approach provides more flexibility and reactiveness. For science diplomacy to be more effective and efficient, there should be more integration among actors to help to bridge the gap between science and policy. One way to promote that is to incorporate science advisory services into countries' foreign policy and avoid the trial thinking which has unfortunately become a distinctive pattern of international organizations. We need more of such initiatives in order to have a critical mass for advancing science diplomacy. The third challenge is the capacity gap between demand for and supply of science diplomacy. We also need to build the capacities of scientists, particularly in their early careers in soft skills areas such as leadership and communication. While we experience budgetary restrictions in many countries, science diplomacy practitioners will have to come up with innovative ways to mobilize the resources and build partnerships and networks. I want to conclude my preliminary remarks by stressing that in the current global context, a shift from multilateralism to plurilateralism may be worth considering in some areas because at the end of the day, the majority always tend to join a winning coalition or a successful strategy. And science is a natural international enterprise. No one can do science alone, confined in their backyard. While reading, he was reading, Lassina, some time ago about multilingualism in diplomacy, I came across this old and perhaps no longer politically correct catchphrase that one should use many languages to be properly understood, speaking to Latin, speaking to the military, German, speaking to the merchants, Greek and Arabic, speaking to the musicians, Italian, speaking to his cook, Chinese, speaking to the sailors and engineers, English, speakers to the artists, Russian, speakers to friends, Spanish, speakers to enemies, Dutch and Hungarian, speakers to his girlfriend, French, speakers to his wife, Japanese. I don't know why Japanese. I have stayed in Japan more than 7 years, but I did not understand this. Speaks to his wife, Japanese. To that, I shall add, speaks to global issues, science and diplomacy. It is indeed of highest priority that scientists sit at the market of policy and that policymakers use science to address global issues. To address the major items on the global agenda, whether it's climate change, food security, depletion of the ozone layer, security threats, pandemic, or the sustainable development goals, we will have to more and more resort to science and technology to overcome political resistance and expand and deepen international cooperation. When diplomacy and politics fail to satisfactorily address global issues, science diplomacy is the answer because science provides avenues and fields for cooperation that can contribute to establishing constructive, mutually beneficial dialogues. Science diplomacy provides common ground, a neutral and fact-based language which can in turn be used to build bridges between opposing political positions, opposing political borders. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. As you see, we have two moderators with us today, so let me, in absence of Princess Sumaya, so please pass on our well wishes to her and hope we see her tomorrow. My name is Peter McGrath. I'm the coordinator of the Inter-Academy Partnership. We're a global network of 140 academies of science and medicine, headquarters in Trieste in Italy and at the US National Academies in Washington, USA. It's my pleasure here to introduce the next two speakers to you and give you a flavor of some of the work that the academies are doing with different partners over the years. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Jonathan Foreman, the science advisor at the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Please, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if we can slides. Okay, I think I should be good. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm going to start off with a small disclaimer saying that what I'm going to talk about may not represent the views of my bosses, and you'll understand that more when you see my bosses in the next few minutes. And I'll start off with a discussion of chemistry and war and disarmament. The use of chemicals to harm people goes back to ancient times. There's an actual archaeological site in modern-day Syria where an invading army dug tunnels and burned materials to make poison gases in the tunnels, so the Roman soldiers that went to fight them were killed. In the 17th century, people tried to put poisonous leaves of plants into munitions to make poisonous smoke, not very successful. But in that same war, in 1675, the first ever chemical disarmament treaty, or arms control treaty more realistically, a ban on poison-coated bullets by the Holy Roman Empire and France. The American Civil War was not a war of chemical weapons as we think of them today, but there were pitches made to the leaders of both sides of the conflict to use munitions that could deliver poisonous gas as a means to end the war sooner. Neither president took them up on it, but 50 years after the end of that war, in the battlefields of World War I, munitions that were nearly identical were being used with high frequency. Into the 20th century, development of more toxic chemicals, better protection from toxic chemicals to allow people to use them more effectively when others may not have the same level of protection. And by 1997, the world says we have had enough, a chemical weapons treaty, a total ban, a disarmament treaty that goes into force. Of course, we still hear about incidents with very toxic chemicals, such as this picture from the United Kingdom in 2018, and chemistry continues to advance. This is a chart of the number of chemical compounds in the Chemical Abstracts database from year by year. 217 million chemicals in the database at the beginning of this year, more than 150 million inorganic and organic compounds, and yet only 16 million were known at the time the Chemical Weapons Convention was drafted. People are concerned about chemical terrorism, the access to chemicals, chemicals we don't know about, and when our diplomats and disarmament policymakers speak, it's very difficult for people not familiar with science to separate the science of chemistry from the negative use of chemicals. An interesting thing about the treaty is it tells the policymakers they have to review science and technology, which is very interesting because here are my 193 bosses, all of the countries in green. How do they discuss science? We have a forum and a conversation that will make your head spin. And the conversation is underpinned by concern and fear of new chemicals. What will happen? Scientific reports that tell us that there may be new dangers from chemical research. And scientists themselves, when they talk about science, maybe they use terminology that the security people don't understand. My son loves this book. Mentos and Coke have made him want to be a scientist. But when I say irresponsible science in the office, people will get very, very nervous. How do you implement a chemical weapons treaty? Destruction of chemical weapons. The need to inspect and verify for compliance chemical production facilities, even commercial ones. The investigation or fact-finding for allegations of non-compliance. Assistance to states' parties. And the use of science to form bridges to build trust across international borders. All of these things require science. And the people that implement the convention are not diplomats wearing suits and ties. They are engineers and scientists and technical people like this group of inspectors that you see here. This has made the Chemical Weapons Convention actually, surprisingly, a forum for scientific collaboration. A network of 26 laboratories across 19 countries that develop analytical tools to help verify compliance. A scientific advisory board that in its 22 years of existence has seen participation from scientists from more than 40 nations. They even publish in peer-reviewed science journals their findings, their work. Interesting papers here. authors from India, Pakistan, the United States, Russia, China, Cuba, Sudan, all in the same paper with 15 other authors. It's really a nice example of scientific collaboration. The countries are required to destroy their chemical arsenals. This chart shows the progress. The black, the total amount declared, the blue, the light blue, the total amount destroyed, nearing 100%. And this gave OPCW in 2013 a Nobel Peace Prize for progress in the elimination of chemical weapons. Interesting about destroying chemical weapons is you do it with chemistry, making perhaps the hydrolysis reaction the chemistry of peace. And then the elephant in the room when you talk about OPCW, Syria. So I take you back to 2013. Inspectors were deployed. They collected environmental and biomedical samples after getting to the site of an incident. They applied chemistry techniques developed by that network of laboratories, and their analytical chemistry results were given to then UN Secretary General to give a report to the nations of the world. Information from that report was put into the briefing notes of high-level diplomats who negotiated a deal to put Syria into the Chemical Weapons Convention, remove chemicals across an active war zone, put them onto ships that were from Norway and Denmark and guided by ships, Navy ships from 5 other countries, go to Italy, unload mustard agent and a nerve agent precursor onto an American ship that sails into international waters to do hydrolysis, and then all of the chemicals, industrial chemicals associated with the weapons program, and also the waste products, go to facilities for incineration in Finland, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Republic of Texas. 1,300 tons of chemicals destroyed. And voluntarily destruction of military facilities associated with chemical weapons. But of course, the elephant in the room again is that allegations have not stopped. I think this is a nice example of science can inform international relations, it can make things happen, but science by itself is not diplomacy or a substitute for political will. Back to my 193 bosses. You might be surprised to know it was only 8 of them that joined this convention with chemical stockpiles, and you might ask, if only 8 have chemical stockpiles, what incentivizes the others? What incentivizes the others is another part of the Chemical Weapons Convention that says chemistry should be used to benefit mankind, and countries should be encouraged to share science, use science to build relationships, build economies, build scientific knowledge. This is interesting. I don't know if you've seen this chart or not. This is an old chart. It represents all of the scientific publications between 2008 to 2012 across all fields of science, where the lines between cities are connecting cities where the authors on these scientific papers were collaborating. So this is international science collaboration worldwide. This is the norm of our convention. But in security circles, people are nervous. They say, all this talk about science, all this science sharing, what are they sharing? We don't know. It's happening outside our convention. The OPCW facilitated meetings in 2015, brought together scientists from 20 different nations to talk about ethical guidelines and ethical codes and what might be useful in the application of chemistry that supports the norms of the Chemical Weapons Convention. An exercise in embracing ethics and responsibility, building trust to those outside scientific communities. But let me ask a rhetorical question. How do the diplomats then build trust with scientists? Do they talk about promoting ethics and responsibility in their policy making? Do they embrace scientific literacy in their decision making? And I think as many good examples as I can give you of embracing science and diplomacy and policy in different forums, there are still big walls between the two sides, and the conversations are often one-sided. And so as I wrap up, I would say disarmament requires science. I hope you can appreciate that from what I've shown you in the implementation of the treaty. And decision-making benefits from scientific literacy. And is there a way you can get the scientists involved? Here we have diplomats from around the world extracting the DNA from a strawberry in the OPCW as we are getting them to embrace experiments. I stop here. A periodic table, OPCW theme. It looks like chemistry, but if you look closely, it is actually about our state's parties. And I would say our collective future security requires both communities to find interesting ways to productively interact and share their experiences in making productive relationships so that one can draw upon the opportunities of science to help in international relations and draw the scientists in to understand what is of concern and importance to the policymakers will help you get those discussions about responsibility that many people are seeking.
Thank you, Jonathan, for showing us some of the successes of the OPCW, but also that we still have a little way to go. And also for both of the speakers for putting science diplomacy at the heart of this discussion that we're having today. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Professor Indira Nath from India, who's been, apart from all her other work, integral in some of the IAP work on responsible research conduct and looking at sort of dual-use research issues and so on. So, Professor Nath, do you have a PowerPoint?
Peter, for the introduction. Also the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. It's a beautiful building and a beautiful city, but I cannot praise the weather too much. It's not been very good. I thought I would talk about, is it okay? Can you hear me? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought I'd talk about some of the successes we've had. I mean, science has not been all that bad, you know. It's really done good things. And the thing that worries us, perhaps in this discussion today for peace, is can society ever keep up with science? And that's because it's moving so rapidly. And it seems impossible for society, law, and ethics to keep pace with this rapidity. I think that can be qualified a little bit. What we can perhaps be able to see are the recent developments that are happening. But when you have experiments with unintended consequences, like we had with the CRISPR, which I will talk about a little later, then ethics has to rethink and re-meet and get the whole story going again. So it's not that we can't keep up, but we need to be quite vigilant about it. And then can we predict the future is something that's puzzling. There are more questions than answers. And because really we cannot imagine the most exciting and dramatic changes that may occur. For instance, even 2 decades ago, people were talking about artificial intelligence. But you know, the way the mobile phones developed and the way the social media has grown around such digital inventions was not predicted at all. And at the moment, we're reading the dictionary of life and the DNA, and we can look at the letters and we can see some connections and pick up some words. But we haven't written the novel as yet. We haven't seen the story, the full story, etc. So there are more questions than answers. And then I always think about where will synthetic biology take us? It seems such an exciting mix of disciplines which can be handled virtually, and then you come back and do the experiments. So why have we had more questions is because the blurring of boundaries between disciplines has become really paramount, and now science is no longer so disciplinary as many of us who had titles of professors were given a subject. It's now become multi and also transdisciplinary. And research is not conducted by now an individual, but large groups of people who form teams, and they're all over the world. And these people don't have to be in one place. Your partner could be in another continent, and that's made it even more exciting and more worrying, because then the ethics of the 2 countries, the 2 nations, as this morning we were discussing the cultural differences, need to be sorted out. And digital online publishing, for instance, seemed great, and yet we couldn't envisage the misuse of it as predatory journals, which are becoming really a pain for scientists. So, and we still haven't, as a society, learned how to manage equity, I think. And I particularly refer to equity in gender, in publications also, which tend to be more West-oriented, and I'd like to say more empire-oriented. And the time has come for the empire now to strike back and get back into more equity. So the successes, as I've mentioned, I'll just mention them by title, is like synthetic biology. Now, but the problem with it is that it's highly dependent on data sets, because it has virtual design, manufacture and testing involved, and anything digital, it seems to me, can be hacked. And therefore, I worry also about artificial intelligence, particularly in the area of health, which I belong to. And there are more and more interactions in diagnostics and with robotic surgery, which is wonderful for life-saving for remote areas and has been one of our success stories. But again, it gets prone to hacking, and then you wonder what is going to happen. So unpredictable developments and consequences of machine learning seem to be, to me, a worrying concern. And then when we look at the future, of course, we've had mitochondrial donation, which has been now permitted, so you have babies with 3 parents. So it's a wonderful, successful story. When you think that any genetic disease that's passed through the mother can be overcome by having 3-parent babies. But then it raises all kinds of questions amongst societies and how different cultures will view this. And I think it's still not very clear what is permissible. And in some countries like UK, which underwent, I think, a fairly long discussion on this, on ethical issues, has permitted it, and it is life-saving. But other societies, how they will take it is the question. And human genome, we've had since morning talking about it. And really this developed, as you all know, by asking a question which was very basic, and that is, how does a sore throat bacteria, which causes sore throat, defend itself against a virus? So it was immunology of the bacteria against the opponent that was being discussed. And yet, as a result of that, we discovered a system that's now present in everyone. So obviously it's evolutionary, quite old, and now this can be used to do all kinds of magical things. So all this enormous potential we have for cure of genetic diseases is a success story, but we haven't seen the future as yet. And at the moment we are allowing somatic cell editing. Most countries permit that, but embryo editing is still taboo in most places. And where it's been permitted for basic research, like in UK, it's up to a limited period, and implantation is certainly not permissible at all. We say all that, and yet we know that we've had a questionable experiment in China where Dr. He claimed he produced twins whose CCR5 mutation, which is supposed to protect you against HIV, he managed to produce these twins. So that raises the question that you may have a ban on something from another West-oriented ethical point of view, but someone else can do this. And one Russian scientist has said very boldly he plans to do it because his country, he thinks, will probably permit it. And so you have these kind of concerns, and can we have a global ethical policy at all becomes questionable. And what seems to be clear, again, from the Western ethical point of view is that enhancement and designer babies will not be prevented. So you can't augment people to have stronger muscles, produce a military that is stronger than the average human being. But how long will it be before that is broken too, is something I ask myself. So all these biotechnology developments, of course, lead to security concerns, like the chemistry person just intended. But I don't plan to discuss bioweapons at all. But just to say that every experiment we do in biology or biotechnology, biosecurity becomes a component of it, mainly because infections do not recognize geopolitical borders, and therefore you have a lot of genetic engineering type of harm which is done to plants in one country can go across to another country. So to me, it seems that we need a global consensus and monitoring required for many of these. And what does this mean from responsibility point of view is we need to ask questions together, like we are doing in this conference, and we need to look for patterns from the past to predict the future and provide formally systems for global participation and debate on emerging technologies. This is not something that we have as yet. We talk about ethics and we get together here and hear some of the newer developments, but we don't have systems by which we can discuss really how the emerging technologies are going. And I think, it's all very well to say you must do good and you must have ethical practices, etc. But I think perhaps a time has come that we need to incentivize such good ethical practices. I know it's very cynical to say that, well, good should be good, why should you be awarded for being good? But it seems that such a thing might help in controlling investigators and institutions. And for this we need global harmonization, a very robust governance and stewardship in general. And for that you need all these people that I've spelled out: researchers, policymakers, funding agencies, journals particularly need to be cautious, and governments and civil society. In other words, it looks to me as if we all have to be bioethicists, not just the scientists or the ethicists, but society as a whole will now become bioethicists. And therefore it's very obvious we need to have transparency, we need to protect our data from hacking, equity needs to improve, and therefore the pursuit of truth. I think the core values we hold at the moment are even more important and need to be emphasized while we worry about the future ethical issues that will come up. And preventing misuse, I think, is very important. So since we need all this, so one of the suggestions made at a meeting at the Nuclear Threat Initiative was maybe we should give a seal of approval for institutions or investigators who are practicing good ethical methods in their research. And maybe that kind of, we can call it seal of approval or accreditation or something, which might incentivize more and more people to join our global worry. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nath. And I think Professor Nath and the previous speaker have sort of drawn our attention to the fact that there is this mismatch between the dynamism and the speed at which science and research can move, and how the existing ethical framework can withstand it and accommodate it, and also how science institutions involved in global science can accommodate themselves to this fast-paced action. And I think in the second part of the session, our two speakers will address that and broaden the discussion out and perhaps the methodologies already established will be seen in a more global context. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Flavia Stegel, who's Special Envoy for Science and Global Policy at the International Science Council. And Dr. Stegel was formerly ADG for Natural Sciences at UNESCO, and she was a staunch supporter of Jordan for our World Science Forum 2017, a member of the steering committee, and we're delighted to have her back and to join us on this panel. Dr. Stegel, thank you.
I quote, "We are speaking on this occasion not as members of this or that nation, continent or creed, but as human beings, members of the species man, whose continued existence is in doubt. Many warnings have been uttered by eminent men of science and by authorities in military strategy. None of them will say that the worst results are certain. What they do say is that these results are possible, and no one can be sure that they will not be realized," unquote. These quotes are from a manifesto which has become known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. It's been brought to the attention of the broader public on July 9th, 1955 in London at Caxton Hall by a group of scientists, among them Russell, Einstein and Rotblat. And it was considered as one of the milestones in the fight to control and ban weapons of mass destructions. And it looks at peace, something what I will explain later as negative peace. It's the avoidance of conflict. But we could also think about the positive peace, where really invest in opportunities and in the capacity of people and institutions to create peace. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan, the Inter-Academy Partnership to invite the International Science Council, myself to speak to you here today. And obviously I join Peter in sending the best regards to our great champion, beloved Royal Highness Princess Somaya. We really hope that she's going to get up well again quickly and that we can meet with her tomorrow. And together with my co-panelists, I really try to maybe provide some contribution to the argument for, but also to the practice for science and peace, or science in peace. And I appreciate this opportunity because I think it's really interesting, because it's a continuation of the discussion which started, as Conor just mentioned, at the World Science Forum in Jordan. And it's good to know that we're trying to bring this to more concrete topics and maybe also results and actions. And I would like to ask you, if you have not done so yet in the evening, please look at the illumination of this wonderful building, because among many images, you see the image of crumbling walls. Walls falling down between scientific disciplines, walls falling down between scientists who would like to cooperate with each other internationally, but also walls crumbling down, which are built by more and more nationalistic policies. And I'd like to thank the Hungarian Academy of Sciences for this very strong message. I mentioned positive and negative peace. This is a terminology which is used by the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index is published now for about 13 years, once a year, by an independent think tank. And we have the latest report came out in July this year, and about the peacefulness, obviously, of the world, the image is rather gloomy. The Global Peace Index looks at 3 areas: about conflicts nationally and internationally, about societal security and safety, but then also at militarization. And when you look at the global trends of the last 10 years, the Global Peacefulness Index, the peace in the world has gone down. And it also says that the gap between the most peaceful nations and the least peaceful nations is growing. And then obviously the more peaceful ones become a little bit more peaceful, but the less peaceful nations become less peaceful. and that this has obviously a great economic impact. And so they do also put a price tag, both individually but also societally and also financially, on this peacefulness in the world. So the ice has become thinner, not only on glaciers and in the Antarctica, but the ice has become thinner also for peace, for cooperation, and it has become thinner also for the global scientific community. Limited resources, obviously, climate change, overconsumption, social injustice, and so on, plus also to consider massive investment by vested and business interests. Look at tobacco companies, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and other companies, the fossil fuel companies. How much money is invested in what has been, to turn serious sciences into what has become now known as a hoax, as fake news, activities which have turned democratic elections into Russian roulette. And I think this is something we really have to be very careful about. Have we actually lost in the world completely all types of integrity, and how can we rebuild this again? I mean, this comes with the question, who can be trusted? Because when we look at the word peace, pace, and in other words in other languages, when we come from the Roman languages, it goes back to the Latin word of pax. And pax means not only peace, it also means pact, it means agreement, it means treaty. So it is something which we jointly create. We have to have commonly shared values, even morals. We have to have beliefs which we set together, define together, and then we come to agreement and we should adhere to it. But how can we trust when all of a sudden people get out of treatments without really any reasoning, when treaties are not being respected anymore? So trust has to be given, it should be earned, and it can very easily be lost as well. And trust is something which we should have the freedom to enjoy, with actually too much battling for it, but it's also a responsibility which we have to take care of that trust and to be able to create these peaceful conditions. And freedom and responsibility is also something which is enshrined in the constitution of the International Science Council. We just had now, the International Science Council was merged last year, so it's a new institution, bringing together the natural and the social sciences. So the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility of Sciences had its first meeting. I mean, the main objectives are really to ensure mobility, obviously, then, but also the right to associate, to express itself, and to have access to data and to information. I'm very happy to see here April Tash. She did attend that meeting as well, explaining us the UNESCO recommendations for the freedom of science and scientific researchers. Absolutely essential document, it seems to me, in this discussion, because it looks after the 1974 recommendations now to a much larger scope. It's not just the scientific researcher, it's also the science, so it has a systemic approach. So it's the rules and regulations, it's the institutions, and so on, and it's the individual. But it also paints a much larger scope than academic freedom, which, when we really take it seriously, relates to tenure professors, but nobody else really, to a human rights perspective where we all, everybody participating in that scientific enterprise has the freedom but also the responsibility to speak up. What are a few activities or initiatives which also give me and my work hope when I look at the last few years, a rather gloomy picture? It is the 2030 agenda, I must admit. I think it's not the perfect development agenda, but it's the best we have, and it gives a great role to the SDGs. It is obviously the merger of the International Science Council, a response to the 2030 agenda in closing the gap between the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. It is an organization like INCSA, the International Network for Science Government Advice, trying to build the capacity jointly between politicians, administrators, practitioners and scientists, because we have to learn how to do this. It's also a regional example of positive development, the African Open Science Platform, about the governance of data, that this has to be taken into the hands by Africa themselves, by the actors in Africa, with and for Africa. And I see part of that process of taking care of your own heritage and what you own, and not have it exploited by somebody else. It is the World Science Forum as an institution, and I mean, I think it's great when we look back to Jordan, where we had the first World Science Forum in the Arab region, and two great decisions coming out of this. One is to continue as a regional Arab Science Forum, and I also would like to remind that in that global peace index, obviously the MENA region is the one which is least peaceful, so I think there is an extra argument to invest obviously in that region, and also to come up with the first charter for ethics in science and technology in the Arab region. Very intelligent document, because obviously it also caters to the fact that ethics, morals, values, they have a cultural connotation which we have to take into account, and I think it's going to be launched tomorrow at noon, so you hope you'll all be there and you're really going to support this. And last but not least, as a very important element of science for peace, is that we have to enlarge the voices in that concept. And the institution of the Global Young Academies, I think, is a very important step in that young and early career scientists speak up, create their voice, get organized. This is not about some white old professors in some thick buildings which look nice but have walls which are really way too thick. I think it is really up to breaking down the wall here also intergenerationally, and to get these ideas, the concerns of future generations, to the table of power and governments. I come to my last point here quickly. This is now, because it is about speaking, is about having a voice, is about diplomacy. Because I mean, even if I say that speaking up is not just a freedom, but is a responsibility for scientists, obviously you have to be careful how you speak up. You have to be diplomatic about the way you speak up. And when I look now at the UN system is exactly as strong and as efficient as member states let it be. And I mean, the world has to become more polarized. Obviously, there are intents to weaken that multilateral system. And I think here the responsibility of the science is twofold. The scientists have to show, well, that's actually what I would like to see coming out, obviously, is that multilateral systems are important, that they can work if they have the critical conditions and enabling factors, that we need this multitude of voices to create a consensus. But I think the scientists also have to provide concrete answers for the big challenges we see. And there I see another movement which is very hopeful to me is the magic bullet is not going to come from some new kind of technology which will allow us just to continue the way we produce and we consume. I think the real strength will come up from the social sciences, because this is about behavior, this is about the way we encounter each other, this is the way how we debate and how we govern big issues. So I think this is really now also the time, I guess, for the social sciences here to pick up a little bit speed, and I hope that an institution like the International Science Council can represent here both the natural and the social sciences. I think there are the usual suspects of cooperation within the UN system. I mean, it's obviously the Secretariat DESA, it's the UN agencies, it's all the different groups. But I think there are two entities where the International Science Council is now investing in reaching out. One is the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, because again, this is a human rights issue. This is not a science or a government or an administration or whatever issue. I think it is a human rights issue. And the other one is because it is about peace and security. There is a role for the UN Security Council to play as well. That sound science systems do prevent wars and conflicts, but that we also need peaceful times so that we can create a sound science system. So I mean, it's a little bit the chicken and the egg, and I think we have to work from both ends. But for this, a body like the UN Security Council has to be convinced of that importance. In conclusion, I think we need this new perspective. We have to highlight it, and I would also be, if I had the opportunity to have a wish for example, the Arab Science Forum, that the human rights perspective will be highlighted. I think we have to get new and creative alliances, intergenerational, with other actors which might not be too scientific at all. And I think we also need a new excellence. It's not just excellence in science, it's not just about the citation index, tenure track. It's very much also about relevance, about responsibility, about ethics and values. And I think as a scientific community, we have to create a new excellence framework where we can make sure that we're actually responding as a science community, not just to our individual ambition and career desire, but really to the challenges out there. And in thanking you, I'd like to take just another 20 seconds of your time with the last quote from that same manifesto, and I quote, "There lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings, to human beings, remember your humanity and forget the rest." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flavia. And it was very useful, I think, helpful to mention the Global Peace Index and the worrying factor that we are facing not only wealth gaps, knowledge gaps, but a peace gap, and that can only lead to trouble for everybody, not just those who are on the wrong side of the gap. In terms of looking at the overall global science community, it's also interesting to note that the UN system and various other bodies, including as is now the ISC, have come from very different backgrounds and places. They've represented different stakeholder groups. And now is a time, and consolidation is taking place, and the ISC is a prime example where stakeholders are coming together and looking for a single voice to speak for science. Now, our final speaker is representing the younger generation of scientists, and that's another wall, another gap that reference has been made to, that there have been several decades where younger and emerging scientists have not been listened to. We've certainly made an effort in the World Science Forum in recent years to not only include younger scientists, but to involve them at the very heart of what we're doing. So particularly at a time when society is evolving so rapidly, who better to monitor, map, and react to this than those who are closer to the action. So I'd like to welcome Tallulah Oni from the Global Young Academy, former co-chair and a public health physician scientist.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. The challenge of going last is always trying to not repeat everything that's been said. So I could just say what they said, and that would be it. But I'm going to instead focus on what is being done, because we've had a lot of reflection on the past, on what's going on at the moment, and I'm here to give you a sense of the kinds of action and proactive strategies being taken by young scientists globally. So I'm going to focus my talk in a few different ways. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the need to speak with a unified voice. And I'm going to talk about how we need to be heard, how that unified voice needs to be heard. Thirdly, I'm going to reflect a little bit on the science system and the importance of addressing the current limitations within the science system. And lastly, I'm going to speak to the question of whether the current structure of science for policy is fit for purpose. Okay. So firstly, speaking with a unified voice. How do we speak with a unified voice as scientists? I would say that there are 4 ways that we need to do this. The first is we need to get organized. The second is we need to agree on societal priorities and align our incentives accordingly. The third is we need to be training scientists with the cross-cutting skills to address these priorities. And the fourth is we need to be deploying scientists across all of society. So if we pick on each of those, I can give you a bit of a sense of what is already happening. And I will make reference just to activities within this meeting, just in the last 72 hours, so you have a sense of the proactive nature of the task at hand. So the first, in getting organized. Just yesterday, Flava, you made mention of the Global Young Academy, but just yesterday, several different young scientist organizations got together. So that's from National Young Academies, from the Arab World Association of Young Scientists, from the Marie Curie Alumni Association, and of course the Global Young Academy, the GYA. Organizations that share a common purpose of recognizing the roles and responsibilities of science for society. And one of the key goals of getting together in that session was to identify ways to collaborate and to join efforts, because we recognize that whilst we operate either nationally, globally, or regionally, in order to speak with a unified voice, we need to get organized. So that is already happening. The second is agreeing on societal priorities and aligning incentives. And I will point you to a recent declaration that was launched again yesterday afternoon, to the Declaration of Guiding Principles of Young Academies. And this has brought together 40 different young academies globally to agree on understanding as a group of scientists in practice across different sectors of society, what are the guiding principles that we agree to work towards? Some of those have been mentioned already this afternoon. Priorities like excellence, recognizing excellence, but recognizing that the current definitions of excellence within society, within science, are very limited and don't align with the priorities that we actually seek if we are to deploy science for peace. Principles like the importance of impact and the responsibility of us that scientists have to reflect on the nature of the impact of their science in society. Principles like diversity and inclusion, and that might be diversity across disciplines, that might be diversity across gender, across a whole range of characteristics, and the importance of inclusion. We can't speak with a unified voice if only some of us are represented. There are a few more principles, but I will leave you to investigate that. The third point is training scientists with the cross-cutting disciplines, cross-cutting skills to address these challenges. A day before the conference started, the GYA and the IAP organized a Young Scientist Leadership program. This was a 2-day program that has been run over several iterations. It's been run as a pre-conference training session for young scientists in the last couple of World Science Forums. And the key outcome of this leadership program is firstly to connect young scientists. So it had over 40 young scientists who were attending this meeting together for peer training, for personal development, to reflect on what are the gaps needed to take on this challenge. We spoke earlier, there was mention of soft skills. My one wish is that we eradicate that term and replace it with critical skills. Because if science is to step up, to lead the way in achieving a more inclusive, peaceful society, these are indeed critical skills that are required of scientists. And a key outcome of this Young Scientist Leadership training is a statement that is currently being, we have people who were part of the workshop currently working away to summarize some of the key priorities that have been identified, the key challenges that are faced, but importantly, strategies to proactively address this. So I'd encourage you to look out for this statement that will be a direct output from this workshop, and not just as an academic statement, but also put into the media and in more broader society, because it's important that we hear from this voice that is getting organized on the strategies as they see to address these challenges. And the last point, to deploy scientists across all of society. I was really encouraged to hear you mention in the first talk, I think, about when we talk about scientists, we're not just talking about the academic institutions, we're talking about science in the academic institutions, we're talking about science in policymakers, we're talking about science in practitioners, we're talking about science in civil society, because we already have scientists in all aspects of society. And we do ourselves a disservice to only think about science within in the limited context of academic institutions. So that leads me to my second point of how to be heard. I think that reflection highlights the importance of spaces like this, like the World Science Forum, that enable these connections, that enable the opportunities for growth and collaboration, like with the Young Science Leaderships, that underscore the importance of bridging worlds, which you mentioned in the City BO talk. So whether that is cultural bridging, disciplinary bridging, geographic bridging. Because if we don't have the exposure to these different worlds and understand the ways to put the critical skills that we learn into practice across these different sectors, we don't really stand a chance of reaching our potential. And I think that statement that I mentioned from the Young Science Leaders is something to really reflect on, because as we start talking about and start thinking about how to go about this, the young scientists are starting to highlight a roadmap to achieving this. The third point, which I talked about in terms of science systems, can be otherwise named, but not without. Because, and this speaks particularly to the academic environment, and I'm an academic. Because the reality is at the moment our science structures undervalue the very values that we embrace. We don't sufficiently recognize the validity and important role that scientists can and do play across all of societal sectors, not just within academia. And I appreciate the point that you made, Flavia, as well, on the importance of recognizing this. And I feel like we keep talking about it, but in each and each of our spaces, are we asking how we can change this? How we can change the incentive structure to really start to embrace the complexity required to measure the critical things that we value. Because we can't continue to think of this engagement as a thing on the side, a luxury, at the same time as understanding the core nature and the core task at hand. In my last point, reflecting on whether the current structure is fit for purpose, I've taken the liberty of extracting some key points from each of the talks that came before, just to highlight how some of those key points are currently being explored and how we're currently exploring strategies to address the deficits. That is a perfect example of the future, present right now, with the artificial intelligence taking over. So the first point is learning from the past, and I hope we're not lost, even though Siri is telling us otherwise. Learning from the past to predict the future. I think if we ask ourselves whether what our role is in doing this, if we say it's so important to learn from the past and predict the future, how much of this learning from the past is part of core scientific training? Because at what point do you only learn from the past after you've made the mistakes of the past? I think that highlights an example of how important it is to incorporate our value structure into our core science training. The second point that I think you made around the importance of drawing scientists in. I hope from my first 3 points that we can add to that we listen to the knocking at the door. Because there are a lot of scientists that are already drawn in, that are at the door, that are knocking, and will soon be pushing the door down to address, because these issues just cannot wait. And these issues require more and more of us and require us to think and do in very different ways. So I am encouraged that drawing scientists in of the next generation will not be the challenge. The challenge will be how do we support and push them in the push as well as the pull. The third point you made around, there was a question around, can society keep up with science? I would ask, can science keep up with society? Because, as you mentioned, Flavia, so these core societal values that are evolving we have to be responsive as a science practitioners to keep up with that changing society. And it's important that we recognize that. And again, the scientists of today who will play a role in the future of society are engaging with this. The penultimate point that was made is a difficulty in predicting the future. I would add to that, what are the ways in which, in our various spheres of influence, we are proactively supporting the practice of science that enables informing of that future? And that is a question we have to ask ourselves. And my last point that was drawn from my previous panelists was that peace is something we jointly create. And that has to be created within a climate of trust. Trust is something that we hope will come as a freedom, but something that has to be earned, and also a responsibility. And I'm here to tell you that young scientists are picking up that mantle of responsible practice of science but also the responsibility for a more inclusive and peaceful society. And that all we have to do is individually, collectively, and institutionally recognize and support these efforts that are speaking science into policy, speaking science into civil society, into diplomatic efforts, and ultimately into peace. So if I had 3 words, I would say, we got this. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's great to end on an upbeat note too. So we've got limited time, so we might go straight to the audience for questions. And if you could keep them brief, and hopefully the panelists will get a chance to respond to their co-speakers also in the process. So we've got this lady here. There, behind. Yes, I think you're first.
So my name is Helen Gavin from Science, People and Politics, and a very quick observation to Lula. I'm glad you mentioned the academic loading of science. I don't see scientists here from industry and from diplomacy and from civil service. So what impact and what interaction do leaders in science have with the economic community? So if you think about the impact of science on the bottom line, that's all of science, not just academics. How much knowledge and interaction do the leaders have with things like international accounting practice, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and the macroeconomic and microeconomic structures? Because if you are going to have an impact, not as leaders, that seems to be a good place to be. So what impact can you have?
Should we take 2 questions and you can decide which you might like to answer? So this gentleman in the front.
I'm the director of the Marine Science Station in Jordan. Actually, I work in an area and making research on water, and water molecules don't know borders. So the Gulf Aqaba is shared by 4 countries, and so I think diplomacy for science for diplomacy here is a must and not a choice. And we have published an article recently about diplomacy and science in the Middle East, especially for saving the Gulf Aqaba. I just want to say that there are so many challenges that is really facing in our faces. I as example, mainly the politicians. Politicians don't believe in science, many of them, and they are mostly not scientists. Maybe they didn't pass school, maybe sometimes, but so this is really one great problem. So when you talk with them about sustainability, about environment, they know money only, the language of money. So this is really one big challenge. So I just want to ask my specific question. So we have 2 modes for using science. First of all, that scientists collaborating, but keeping conflicts. Okay. There would be using science to change on politics, and this means that scientists should have more power, because scientists in the world, they have no power, especially in decision making.
Okay, and that's an interesting. What is power for scientists? So we'll take both of those questions together. Who would like to start?
Shall we take more than one round of response?
I thought we might come back to it. We'll take this.
Thank you. It's related to the previous question. So my name is Michel Spiro. I am a president of IPA, International Union of Pure Applied Physics, and I am the promoter of an International Year of Basic Sciences for Development in 2022. Jordan helped me a lot to get this proposal recommended by the General Conference of UNESCO for proclamation by the UN. I am also a former president of Sun Council, and I want to illustrate a little bit how much large-scale infrastructure can contribute to peace in the line of what you said. CERN was the first place where German and conflicting countries with Germany after the war went together to work together at CERN. The first place where Israeli and German scientists could work together. It is a place which initiated the construction in Jordan of Sesame. Maybe you would like to ask me to make Sesame for water in the country. Sesame in Jordan, which unites scientists from many conflicting countries. And I think we should advocate more this role of large-scale international infrastructure. We would like to have Sesame in Africa, in Latin America, and we are trying to work for that. So I wanted to just put a little bit to complete what you said and to ask the reactions of the people.
Shall we take these three first?
Or we take more and have one round of response?
Let's do another round after.
Yeah. Who would like to answer it?
Thank you for both those comments. I think particularly the first point highlights one of the points I was making around the training. So at some point we need to think, if we are training scientists as societal leaders, recognizing that they will be deployed in lots of different spaces, we should ask ourselves then what kind of information and what kind of knowledge would be useful to know. The point that you made is certainly not part of any core training I've been part of or that I'm aware of. So I think that is an important point. I would say that they are not just academics in the room, but also science in terms of diplomacy and also policy. But it also recognizes, again, the point I made around who we think of as scientists. And we just need to be careful not to overly box a scientist is this person, therefore if you're not that person, then you probably don't know anything about science, which we intuitively don't believe, but we sometimes heuristically default to. And that leads to my second point around, the second point made around politics. We also have scientists in politics. Maybe not enough. Maybe we should have more. But until we don't have, I would say, I would answer it not specifically directly to your question around in terms of more power for scientists. I would answer from a perspective of recognizing that, again, if we're using science as a tool to positively impact society, we have to positively recognize that the scientists that end up in politics are not just, you couldn't cut it in academia, so you end up in politics as a second choice, which is somehow what we project at the moment. And so if I think I'm good enough, academia is where I'm going to be. If we're all in academia and we don't have science, pro-science politicians, then we end up in this space and we're talking this us and them. So I think it's important, again, as a science system, that we recognize the important role that people who train as scientists play in different sectors of society. And I'm responding to you in the long game to say, well, in the long term, if we don't address the next generation of politicians should be completely different to the current generation. But that's not by default. We have to be proactive and conscious about that.
Yes, I found the question about the water very challenging because we have a similar problem. And I think decades ago, it was in one meeting, it was predicted that countries will be in war over water and sharing of river water, etc. But I have a view when you question whether scientists should have more power. I don't think scientists are gods either. We provide data, we provide information to the best of our knowledge at that given moment. It's the people who have to decide what to do with that knowledge. And by people, I mean the elected members of parliament are the ones who would have the pulse of the people a little more than perhaps the scientists will have. And so the final decision has to be with the elected representatives and with the public. All that we can do is give them information to the best of our knowledge.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, on the power question and the governance question. First of all, yes, I do agree with Cholo. I think we have many scientists here in the room who work in academia, who work in diplomacy, who work in administration. So I'm actually rather positive on that point. But on the power and governance structure, I think, yes, I mean, it is about distributing the power differently. But I think we're probably a little bit obsessed with the science policy interface, it seems to me. It's absolutely crucial. I've invested a lot of my time in it. I believe in it. But I think the point you just made about the citizens is very important to me because, I mean, as a scientist, you probably will speak for science. So you also have a vested interest yourself when talking to a politician. So I think it's very important to talk about the citizens because they're voters, they're consumers, they're actors, they're parents of children or they're children themselves when you think about young people. So I think that interface through the citizens towards the politicians, because it's them electing if they have the right to elect. I think that's a very important one. Not to forget the fact that also as a scientist, we're also citizens, so we're actually electing ourselves. And there may be just a bit of a caveat about this so-called famous neutrality of the facts. I think it is really time that scientists speak up more clearly in the analysis and in the potential impact scenarios and options. Just stating the facts, in my view, is not enough nowadays anymore. You have to take a position, and not speaking up is also taking a political position. So I think I do know that not everybody has the same freedom of speaking up, but I think to take this responsibility of sharing the knowledge and potential impact is one that we have to promote, to cherish, and to protect.
Well, there's quite a wealth of things to speak about and answer. I don't know that I have exact answers to all of them. You talk about what is the power of the scientist. Working as a science advisor and talking to government officials from around the world, it's very interesting to see the decision-making process because science has a lot of value in aiding decision-making, but the decisions are not based on one dimension alone. So the science has to be balanced with all of the other inputs that they're getting, sometimes which are hardly scientific. And the comfort level of science amongst the decision makers can make a big difference as to how much weight they put on the science. So I think building that trust, building those relationships is really important. I would say in my own experience, some of the delegations we see, they bring scientists with them to help in the decisions they're supposed to make or being asked to make. Others don't have access to science advice, or they're not clear who in their ministries they can go to. And that makes a big difference into their comfort levels with the decisions. And at a multilateral level, oftentimes it will become, we don't understand the technical part, so we're going to go with the decision makers from the proponents from the country we like. Just to touch on the industry part, there are many industrial scientists, many industries that work with multilateral treaties. We work directly with we send inspectors to commercial chemical facilities. But there's also expectations and communication styles that really need to be managed. And I'll use one example that's somewhat topical. Some of you may know that the Microsoft president had said that there should be a Geneva Convention on cyberspace because of all the concerns that are taking place. Microsoft officials actually went to the United Nations to talk about this. And the response was rather, this is not the right time. At the same time, I was at a meeting in a country with a national ministry of that country, and they were saying, we want to do something about cyberspace, but the industry won't talk to us, and we don't know how to reach out to them. But clearly a different ministry had told them in New York, this is not the right time. And the interesting part to me there is from a private sector perspective, and I have a private sector background. If you want to make something happen at the top level, the global level, you would go to the global level. You would not go through the national level because that's not your goal. But from my experience working in multilateral diplomacy, things happen at the global level because somebody at the national level champions it, builds coalitions, and brings it forward to the global level. So just the ways people interact also need to be well understood, I think.
So I may maybe add some words on collaboration between the scientists, which you have already really mentioned. I mentioned also in my opening remarks, and there should be regional collaboration between the scientists around some subject matter. And we have to force, and also there should be many decision maker, and here is attending this conference, and we have to take care of the collaboration, especially regional collaboration, especially the region which there is a strict conflict between the regional or the other politics conflicts. Then we have to force collaborate around the subject matter, like the Sesame or the CERN projects. As a scientist also, I would like to propose all of you to construct, also the young scientists, to construct the new projects around the really the important subject matter, but forcing the different nationality and different societies, scientists together. There should be the projects like CERN or Sesame. It should be continued to break down the old walls around the world between the scientists, and also there will be big power to construct also the new power of the science against all the politics, all the decision makers and the other resistant borders.
We've overrun slightly, but if the organisers will indulge us, maybe we'll take 2 more questions. Very, very brief questions and brief answers. Yes.
Thanks for the panelists. My name is Hassan Douek. I'm Palestinian. I come from Al-Quds University. I was a strong supporter for Science for Peace. 10 years ago, I was at the same panel talking there about peace. Now I'm very much frustrated after 10 years of no progress in peace in the Middle East, and especially with the Palestinians. I have been coordinating all projects with many Israeli universities. Now I'm not doing that. And the reason for that thing that we thought that by collaborating and by creating trilateral projects, basically Palestinian, Israeli, Jordanian, American, or Palestinian, Israeli, German, or whatever. And I would like to extend what my friend said, that politics plays an important role. If we do not have a political decisions, the political decisions can help promoting science. If the political decision is not there, then we are not, you are too far, you are coming from Europe, you are not living with us. I live in East Jerusalem. You mentioned the mobility. We invite European professors to come to our university, and they cannot move easily. They cannot get a permit to stay around. So how could I promote science internationally and cooperating internationally, whether it's professors or students, if the mobility is restricted over there? So I now wanted you to advise me, how could I believe again in Science for Peace in my region? I wanted to change my mind. I couldn't change my mind. My institutions is not cooperating, and the reason because the public over there is not enforcing the government to bring peace to the... We choose also projects are cross-border, like water, like environment, like public health, like you mentioned, okay, and it doesn't help. And I'm telling you this from an experience of a person who was on top of their list of cooperating and who stopped cooperating at all. So I think we have listened to you today. We have heard a lot of science, less of peace, but we would like you to help us how to again, okay, believe in Science for Peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And just finally, the lady in the front. There's a lot to digest there.
Yeah, I'm Professor Hanan Makawi at Life Sciences at the Al-Quds University, Jordan. In fact, I will switch gears. I'm not edition. So my specific question is to you, Jonathan Roman. You talked about the chemical weapons. What do you think of the, I think it's more even dangerous part, biological weapons, and how you connect that with the recent advances? It's very rapid, technological advances that you could even convey these to young scientists through social media, YouTube, and it's easy to perform on the lab. It's not that much difficult. And if you notice, there is a gap between the strategies, the laws, guidelines, and these rapid advances. I mean, who will ring the bell? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Thank you. Who would like to start?
Okay, I can make points on both. Policy on science is generally set at a national level. Policy on science is generally set at a national level based on national priorities. So sometimes when the disarmament treaties at the high level, people ask, what are you doing? It's not what you can do, it's the member states have basically committed themselves to making their own policies and laws. The problem that you run into is prioritization, and this actually speaks to the other question. A lot is happening in science. How do you communicate that to decision makers? Because I don't think it's enough to have science collaboration across borders and expect that that by itself is going to change things. You need to make sure that that is very visible and valuable and beneficial to the decision makers. Unfortunately, I can't give you a recipe to do that. That's quite difficult. To come back to your point now about biotechnologies, this is complicated because how easy is it to do? I don't think it's easy. I think it depends on what resources you have, what knowledge you have, what circumstances you're in, and it varies with each individual case. The laws that go into place or the policies that go into place come down to who's informing and who do the decision makers trust. In a world where there is concern about science, a country where there's concern about science, you might have stricter laws. If there's a country that they don't find this to be such a concern, particularly they want to see advances in the science within their country, maybe they don't want to restrict things as much. And then there's the politics of some countries, the security apparatus says we don't trust that people might get this and use it in a way to do something in their garage. So I think this is really about speaking with the people that make decisions on policy for science, and probably most importantly, and I'll say this as running a science board, you have to have a practical advice for decision makers. If you just tell them biological weapons will happen because of CRISPR-Cas9, it's kind of overwhelming. What do you do? But if you try to explain, well, what is it that it actually takes to make this happen, then you can start having a dialogue on what decisions you can take forward or what methods you can move to take forward. And I don't think you will ever have a uniform worldwide consistency in policies. The way the treaties that I deal with work, you would never get any nation to join a treaty if the treaty dictated how they have to set their laws and enforce them. There has to be a bit of, autonomy for the states so that they feel comfortable and trustful doing this.
I must say I feel extremely humbled by the question you raised, dear friend now from Palestine. And I'm not sure whether anybody in this room really has a response to what I do understand, what you're telling us. About this frustration that investing your lifetime into trying to improve a situation and you see all the greater powers around trying to do everything else against it. I mean, what comes to my mind is that this whole science for peace discourse is not an isolated one. I mean, there is the science for peace, it's the politics for peace, it's the economics for peace, it's the shared resources for peace. So, I mean, we can as scientists even do as good as we want or we think individually or collectively. Obviously, there are these other powers around which might be actually much stronger. And if we have heads of states who on, I don't know, an idea or some kind of crazy moment, just do go across international law, or if others get out of a treaty which had been negotiated with many other partners over a very long time, obviously it's very difficult. I just want to make the point that I think here science is not alone. This is also why it is very important to build alliances beyond science and to be aware that there are powers beyond science which obviously have a very powerful stake in the game as well. And I just hope that for you now that we will find younger scientists and citizens who can take up that fight, because it's a fight, it's a battle, and it's a very difficult one, and that the global community stays engaged. And this is why I think conferences like this are still very important to remain engaged and to maybe take a step forward, even if next year we go 2 steps back. But I think it's really we have to remain engaged in this dialogue. Cutting off the dialogue, I don't think it's going to be a response.
And maybe we have one speaker who I know has to leave, so a very quick response.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to your biological weapon story. It seems it's very tempting to see that these developments, which are rapid, can be misused. But governments actually react to situations. And that's why nuclear has become powerful, because so many millions got killed by one atomic bomb being thrown. And chemical has also, as explained, has history of it. Bio, as yet, we haven't seen this massive death because it hasn't happened. And so I think the policy makers are not giving as much importance. But biosecurity as such is becoming a very important policy to follow. Not weaponization, that's another story, because not all biological developments can be weaponized. That's another step ahead. But certainly biosecurity, which is different to just biosafety, is becoming a very hot international topic, and the governments are becoming aware of it. So I would say, that's all I have to say, that we're grateful that bio hasn't killed millions, but it also means that's why the policymakers have less attention. And the Bioweapons Convention, as you know, meets once in 4 years, by which time science has moved fast ahead. But it's improved a little bit, the governance of it, that they have committees now that meet annually or even more frequently, depending on the developments. Like when the flu story came up, they met quite quickly. So things are changing, but we should be grateful we haven't had massive deaths. But it also means that's why the governments are not recognizing it.
60 seconds. I would just, I think, reiterate the importance of the next generation and that pipeline in response, obviously not an answer, because it's a complex and important question, and thank you for grounding us. I think it highlights the interconnectedness of the globe. So a Middle Eastern problem is not just a Middle Eastern problem. We know that the interactions are, geopolitically with other regions as well, and the importance of scientists not just, working in their silos, but interacting and really creating the spaces to continue to have those collaborations. But again, not just within scientists, as you say, experiencing from your efforts, but really not to dismiss your efforts, because I think it's a long game, and undoubtedly I'm certain that your efforts are building on something that will then be built on further, that the next generation won't be starting from scratch. But also the importance of public will for political action, and really when we see our role as scientists in terms of outreach is not just about outreach in educating the public about science, but also about creating and generating that public will to push for the role of science in advocating for peace. So to seek those alliances both with other sectors but also with citizens. So commend your efforts, and I encourage you to continue to invest in the next generation to build on the actions being done. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to the audience too. I think it's clear there's a lot more to be said on Science for Peace, structurally, intellectually, mythology, and mythology, I suppose. So it's something that will perhaps evolve over the years, and I think at the Royal Scientific Society we want to sort of retain an interest in promoting that discussion, science for peace, science for peacefulness, as it was elaborated upon, and I hope we'll all have a chance to discuss again at greater length. Thank you all very much. Success.